Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Ask Kati Anything. I'm your host, licensed marriage and family therapist, Katie Morton. I'm so glad that you're here. In today's episode, I am going to discuss attachment. We're going to talk a lot about attachment and how it can show up in therapy. Then I'll also dig into emotion regulation. We're going to talk about what it is, how it feels, how we do it, and finding healthier ways to regulate overall. And finally, I'm going to talk about attachment in romantic relationships and how we can better manage that as well. If you don't remember, I talked, I think it was last week, about the fact that I'm going to try to pick questions based around a theme or two. So today it's more attachment/emotion regulation, which I kind of feel go together in some ways, just so that if someone is interested on a specific issue or topic, they know that the entire episode is catered to them. And if you're looking to get your questions answered, you can find me over on YouTube memberships. I have 4 live streams that I offer each and every month. Also on Patreon, I have 2 live streams a month. So if you're looking to get a question answered, you can go over there and ensure that it is answered and that you also have more interaction with our community. And if you're looking to improve yourself, to start working on yourself today, you can go over to katiemorton.com and you can check out all of my workshops that are available for purchase. I also have one coming up about overcoming childhood emotional neglect. It's going to happen on October 19th. It will be live. It's a 2-hour workshop and it will be recorded and accessible after the fact. So if you aren't able to join us live, that's okay too. Without further ado, let's jump into this first question. Hi, Katie. I hope you're well. I absolutely love your videos and you're helping me so much. I'm so glad. My question is attachment related. I was in therapy for a year and now ended a few months ago, and I'm really struggling to cope. I have an anxious attachment style with severe abandonment issues. Since the beginning of therapy, I've been super attached to my therapist and feared therapy ending. I told her about everything I was feeling and we worked on therapy ending quite a lot. But we didn't really do any attachment work. We worked more on accepting it, I guess. She is a CBT, that stands for cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT therapist, and told me transference and stuff is not really a CBT thing. It isn't, unfortunately. We'll talk about this. I feel like I'm completely obsessed with her. I think about her 24/7. I Google her obsessively and look at her friend's Instagram. Hers is private. I just miss her so much, and I don't want to live without her. Life doesn't make sense to me now. She's the most amazing person to ever exist for me, and I just love her so much. I know I put her on a very high pedestal, but I am not able to change that. While in therapy, I was always so sensitive to everything she said or any change in tone of voice, and my mood always depended so much on how she treated me. Like I either felt so high on life or like life was over. I tried to grieve therapy ending and losing her, but I'm really struggling. I want her in my life so badly, and I wish she could be my girlfriend. I feel like no one will ever compare to her. There's no way to continue therapy. It came to a natural end because of the service rules. She's also an NHS therapist, so I can't see her for private therapy. Any advice on how to grieve therapy when I feel like I miss her so much? I feel like it would be easier if we would have worked on attachment more, maybe. How can I develop a healthy attachment style by myself now? I also talk to her in my head 24/7 in a maladaptive daydreaming kind of way. I struggle with chronic depersonalization and derealization, so living in my head is not helpful, but I absolutely can't change it. Any advice? Thank you so much, and sorry this is so long. I absolutely adore your videos. Of course. Now we have an add-on here, but let's jump right into this. Now, it's interesting. This is why I get frustrated with things like the NHS, is because you really didn't need a CBT-based therapist. You needed someone who understood attachment, or someone who dealt with borderline personality disorder, did DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, because you didn't work on the root of your issue here. For people who don't understand, CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy really works on kind of this cycle of we have thoughts, then we have feelings about those thoughts, and we take action as a result of those feelings. And we kind of go round and round and round and round, right? And so cognitive behavioral therapy has us pay more attention to the thoughts that we're having. And then we try to challenge them or change them in some way and act differently. And it's really effective. The reason a lot of things like the NHS utilize CBT is because it's one of the only therapeutic techniques, or I guess modalities, that is something we can measure and see is improving. Does that make sense? It's almost like other therapies aren't aren't things that we can always like rank and rate and see an improvement in our patients. We'll see the improvement in the long haul through conversations with our patients, but it's more like qualitative, not quantitative, meaning there's no numbers. We can't like, oh, they improved in their XYZ mood scale by 4%, right? We can't see that in other treatment modalities, but in CBT we can. So it makes it one that people utilize a lot because of that. Because they're like, see, it's working, which I find so frustrating. Okay, into the questions, because that wasn't really your question, but you really needed, like I said, those different styles of therapy. And so how do you develop a healthy attachment style by yourself now? I mean, I have a ton of videos on attachment. It's obviously, you said it's anxious attachment, and I would agree. For those of you who don't know, anxious attachment is that like fear that people are going to leave. Like the person who asked this question said they have this intense fear of abandonment. That fear that people are going to leave causes us to want to hold them even closer. And like we don't want to let them go. We think about them 24/7. We obsess about them. We feel like they'll finally fill that void in us, right? And so that anxious attachment probably comes out of an inconsistency in your parenting growing up, meaning maybe our parents were nice one minute, abusive the next, or maybe they would say they were going to show up and they didn't. Maybe we had a parent who was kind of around or not, or worked away from home a lot. There can be a lot of different reasons we develop this type of attachment. But the true ways for us to heal, because we can move out of an anxious attachment and into a secure one. The real way that we do that is through inner child work, acknowledging that younger us and what maybe he or she needed at the time and didn't get. Are we able to offer those things to ourselves now? Are we able to process through all that happened to us? Are we able to, if there was a trauma, can we work through that so that it doesn't affect us in our day-to-day? All of those are steps along our pathway from an anxious attachment into a secure one. It is hard work, but it's totally worth it, and it can and will get better. I do have tons of videos about inner child work and attachment. I also have workshops on both. Those are great ways for you to kickstart this. I think in general, that's what I would say. That's where I would push you to try, those would be the focuses I would tell you to spend your time working on. And when it comes to the depersonalization, derealization, I really want to encourage you to find some better ways to ground. This could mean we stomp our feet, we shake our body out, we dunk our face in cold water, or we do more like what I would call traditional grounding techniques, where we look around in our room and we look for things that start with the letter A, things that start with the letter B and C, and so on, go through the whole alphabet. Or count the number of things in your room that are blue, brown, black. All of those types of techniques help keep us in the present and essentially hold us or prevent us, not really hold us, prevent us from dissociating. Because we know that we can't work through any traumas, we can't overcome any past pains while we're dissociated. Our brain isn't present, so it's not really able to reprocess. And so we want to learn how to ground so that we can do that work. Now, I know a lot of this you have to do it outside of therapy. That's where like my workshops and videos can hopefully come in handy. That's really where I would ask you to go with this, because it can get better. I'm honestly kind of disappointed again that you were forced into CBT-based treatment and then it was ended and there's no other opportunity, for other treatment. But this missing your therapist is all coming out of that. It's coming out of this childhood wound. My guess would be one of your parents, your mother or your father, never showed up for you in the way that you needed, or maybe was out, like overtly abusive, like physical or sexual abuse. But at the very least, some neglect was happening. And this therapist, your therapist, gave that to you, helped you feel seen, heard, and understood, which are so valuable to us. And so that connection was made, and we thought that she could fill that, or mother or father void in us. And now that our sessions are ended, we feel that void even more intensely. And we want for her to come back so that she can fill it again. And so we have to find a way to fill it ourselves. That's really that inner child work. That's a lot of what you're going to have to navigate yourself, is finding ways to give that to yourself. If it is your mother, I find one of my favorite books for this is The Emotionally Absent Mother, if we find that to be true. And I actually have a video about that. And I mentioned the book as well. I forget the author. I think her name is Lori, but it's a light blue book. It's also in my Amazon shop. You can go to amazon.com/shop/Katie Morton to find it there. Now, the add-on to this is, how can I build a healthy attachment to my therapist? I had a very unhealthy attachment to my old therapist, which has resulted in me having a hard time forming any kind of attachment with my new one. I know he's not out to hurt me, but I can't trust him to not hurt me like my old therapist did. There was a lot of transference and countertransference going on, and because I hastily decided to leave her for the sake of my own well-being, I had developed an eating disorder and was suicidal due to all the turmoil she caused in me. We never got to work through any of the issues. Do I need to work through the damage caused by the attachment I had to my former therapist before I can form a healthy attachment with my new therapist? And if so, do I have to work it through with her, or can this be done by my new therapist? These are all great questions. First of all, I'm so sorry that you had such a bad experience with your old therapist. And I'm glad you got out of there, to be honest, because it sounds like it in some ways became toxic. Now, this person mentioned transference and countertransference. And for those of you who don't know those terms, transference means that we transfer on to someone else the relationship and the emotions associated with it from another relationship. So it's like, I'm taking, let's say my relationship with my mother is a bad one, and I feel very unheard and unseen by her. I take that dynamic of the relationship and I place it onto my therapist, and I play out what would normally happen with my mother. Okay, so I'm transferring that relationship onto a different one. Countertransference, on the other hand, is when we've transferred that relationship onto our therapist. This is specific to therapy, but I guess it could happen in other situations. And the therapist reacts out of that transference, meaning that instead of doing the therapist thing where I hold the space for you and I say things like, that must be really hard, and I know you're feeling a lot of strong emotions right now, and I validate and we seek to understand where it's coming from. Instead of doing that, I react in the way that you're almost expecting me to from that unhealthy relationship. Like I act like your mom would have, or I take it personally. I lash out. And so that dynamic is very unhealthy. And when a therapist encounters countertransference or acts in a countertransference type way, what that tells us as therapists is that we need our own therapy, because we have our own shit that's coming up in session and it's affecting our patient's treatment plan and their therapeutic process, which is not okay. And so I'm so sorry you dealt with that. But to answer your question, yes, we do need to work through this damage that happened with our old therapist. We need to do that work with our current one. And without doing that work, we will not be able to connect healthily with this new therapist, frankly, because we don't know what that looks like. We don't know what that feels like. We haven't experienced it before. And so we need to talk through this. We need to process the grief and maybe the trauma that we sustained through that therapeutic relationship. We need to overcome that. And yes, I know it sucks. Like, went to therapy for support and now we have more problems. You could even, if you felt there was anything unethical happening here, you could file a claim. But unfortunately, just like any other person who has a job, some therapists are good at their job and some therapists are not. And this one was not in your case. And so we're going to want to work on this with our current therapist, not the old therapist. We leave them in the dust. No, bye-bye. We're not going to see them again. However, we need to talk this out, make sense of it, help ourselves process it through, get some validation from our new therapist, and maybe even ask them the question like, what does a healthy attachment look like in therapy? Because I didn't have it here. And to answer that question succinctly, like, what does healthy attachment in therapy look like? The truth about it is that it looks like us looking forward to our time in therapy and, feeling like we have things to talk about. We're excited to see them. Maybe during our week when things happen, we think about them. We're like, oh, I'm going to tell, my therapist that. I'm going to tell whatever their name is. I'm going to tell them that. We think about them that way. We don't feel the need to call them all the time, unless we're in crisis, that's fine. But we don't feel the need to call them. We don't think about them constantly. We don't wish they were our friend or our family member, anything like that. But we just look forward to our sessions. And in session, we see them, we talk about the things we need to talk about, and then we go about our life and then kind of wash, rinse, repeat. There's no obsessions. There's no constant calling. There's no thinking that they're like a parent or a friend or wishing that they were. That all comes from that unhealthy attachment place. Also, it could look like I don't want to tell them too much because if they get too close, they're going to abandon me. So we kind of like push them away. That's also an unhealthy attachment kind of experience. And so it's kind of that looking forward to it, thinking about them and knowing what we want to share, and then just leaving it at that. Okay. Moving on to question number 2. This question says, hey, Katie, could you talk about emotion regulation, please? Of course. I've been talking to a friend about self and co-regulation. Could you possibly explain it a bit about how they relate to each other and how to learn how to self-regulate? I think it's coming from an anxious attachment style for me, and I'm really struggling to self-regulate, but it's so difficult to reach out. It's something I'm coming to realize I struggle with, and I feel like it will strain my relationship with my best friend because she's dealing with me a lot at the moment. She's amazing and so understanding, but I don't want to push this on her. We've already talked about it, a bit about it. Okay, when it comes to emotion regulation, for everybody out there to understand that emotion regulation is our ability to experience an emotion and choose how, when, and how we want to express that. If we don't have any emotion regulation skills, that means that the emotion hits us and we shoot it straight out, or the emotion hits us and we stuff it deep and never deal with it again. Both of those experiences, stuffing and what I'd call emotional diarrhea, both of those show a lack of emotion regulation. Okay. I know a lot of people will think that the stuffing it down is emotion regulation. No. Emotion regulation is more about our ability to manage our emotions and decide when we want to express them, as well as being aware of how they feel, right? So a more awareness of our emotions. So back into the question, when it comes in co-regulation, which is another important piece to emotion regulation, is when we learn to regulate our emotions or to better acknowledge and decide when to express them with the assistance of someone else, meaning that you kind of help each other manage your emotions. And this is having a supportive relationship. You can reach out to them. This could be certain emotional cues that you have agreed upon or you recognize, and so you check in with them. There can be a lot of different types of tools or kind of ways that we're supposed to tell each other about this, but essentially co-regulation is what it sounds like. We regulate our emotions utilizing a relationship with someone, and we both assist each other in this co-regulation, okay? But the question itself here, could you talk about emotion regulation? I mean, that's really what it is. It's very important. Emotion regulation is something that we all need to work on, and I honestly believe it's consistently for everybody a work in progress, because emotions, depending on the situation, can feel really strong or not, easier to manage, more difficult to manage. It can also have a lot to do with our resilience. And so I think it's something that we should all always be aware of. And a huge part of emotion regulation, I believe, is really being able to acknowledge when we're feeling something, which I know can be really difficult. A tip for that is trying to pay attention to your body. I know you hate that advice, but it's the truth. Where do I feel this in my body? And if I don't even know I'm feeling something, if you feel tense, where is that coming? What am I experiencing? Where is this tension? And then we have to think where is this coming from? Am I stressed out? Feeling free to not only check in with what we're experiencing in our bodies, but then trying to tie it back to an experience or situation that we've had or that we're in currently. And you have to be aware of that in order to regulate. If we don't know our emotions are happening and we're completely disconnected, we can't regulate them, right? We don't even know they're there. And so some ways of regulating our emotions are even doing things like meditating. Journaling can help. We can do some mindfulness practices. One of my favorites is actually called the white light. And it's the circle is what you're supposed to imagine, the circle of a white light. You close your eyes and you imagine it going down your entire body. And so you check in as it touches the very top of your hairs or your head. How is that feeling? Check into that area of your body. Is there any tension? Does it feel strained? Is your hair in a really tight ponytail, right? Then we go slowly down. Is your brow furrowed? Are you relaxed? We go through our whole body and how are we feeling? If you have some sexual abuse in your past, feel free to jump over certain parts of your body. But overall, I find that to be a really helpful technique as well. And even getting enough sleep and doing kind of basic things for our mental health gives us the resilience and the ability to regulate better. Okay? So think of emotion regulation as we have to name the emotion. We have to validate the emotion. We can identify our triggers. And then in order to kind of process it through, we can journal or meditate. We can talk it through with a therapist or a close friend. That could be more of that co-regulation. We pay attention when we maybe need a break so that we don't spill them out or stuff it down, right? And those are all some of the ways that we can better manage or regulate our emotions as we experience them. And the rest of this question I actually think I answered it all. How to self-regulate. Those are all those tools, all the tips that I just gave. So I'll say it one more time just in case. Some ways that we can self-regulate, find a better way of, or better strategies for emotion regulation are naming the emotion, validating the emotion, noticing your triggers, practicing meditation or some mindfulness techniques. You can also talk through your emotions with a supportive friend or a therapist. You can journal about them. Notice when you need to take a break so that you don't explode or stuff it down. And make sure that you're, getting enough sleep so that you feel able to do all those things, right? Make sure you're taking care of those, like eating regularly, drinking water, those basic needs type of things. Okay. And as far as your friend goes, I think talking about co-regulation and assisting with that, if you can help her, if that helps both of you, there's nothing wrong with that either. But again, I think to your point, it's like having conversations with that friend of ours, seeing how she's doing. If we feel like we're being too much or overwhelming to her, can we ask her about that? Can we check our facts on that? Can we see if this is something that she would like to help with or something she feels able to help with? Those are all things we can ask a friend before just assuming that they're either someone we can turn to for this or not. Okay? Moving on to question number 3. This question says, I second the idea of emotion regulation. We're staying right on track. I never learned that skill. All I learned from observation was to not show anyone how I feel, right? No emotion regulation can mean that stuffing it back. People always assume it's the outward expression, the explosion. It can be the stuffing. That's problematic for those of us on the spectrum. Yes. I just realized I've had meltdowns in the past. I thought that's what crying or being mad was. Oh, interesting. So I want to process and regulate better going forward. Yes, I think in the urge for us to like stuff things back and pretend that we're okay, almost in the like suppression type of defense mechanism, we stuff the emotions down. We try to disconnect from them. But just like anything, we get too full, right? We can only stuff for so long. And then when our resilience gets low, let's say we're in a different argument, or let's say we didn't sleep well, we haven't eaten in a while, we've had way too much coffee and not enough water, we're feeling sick, run down. That's when we explode. All those repressed and stuffed down emotions just come pouring out. And especially for those on the spectrum, it's going to be helpful for you to understand how to express what you're feeling in the moment, because of the fact that we can be so easily dysregulated. We don't want to stack on top of our autism or whatever that we're experiencing, that like frayed wire. I've described this before, that like obviously I do not specialize in the treatment of autism spectrum disorder. However, a lot of people in our community have been so kind to share their stories and experiences with me. And I read this one particular article I thought was really helpful, where this woman described that she believes autism to be like as if we're all radios, or, everybody knows what radio is. And the wire going into someone who's neurotypical is a clean, crisp sound. It comes out of it. The wire going in is put together perfectly. There's no interruptions. There's no static. Those of us who are not neurotypical, who are maybe a little more neurospicy, those of us on the spectrum, it's like a frayed wire, where sometimes the message is getting through, but it's like the static is strong, the message is blurred. It's hard for us to pick, and it feels very overwhelming. It's like uncomfortable to listen to. Maybe there's like eeks in there, it's almost like back in the day when we had dial-up internet. Sounds a lot like that. And that experience of like life is just too much, that overwhelming, the like sensory processing difficulties that can come along with this, makes it easy for us to get overstimulated and have a meltdown. And because of that piece already being part of our diagnosis, or part of what we're trying to manage, right? Part of our autism, we want to make sure that when we're experiencing upsets in our regular life, like I don't feel connected to you, or I feel like I'm not important, or you said that thing and it hurt my feelings, we don't want to stuff those down, because it will only exacerbate the symptoms of our autism. Does that make sense? And so that being aware of these things is going to help you better manage them. Meaning that the emotion regulation tips that I offered in the last question will help you better understand what your experience is, hopefully communicate or manage it more effectively, so that the meltdowns don't happen with such frequency. Because you can see how they like just essentially make each other worse. Okay? Now, moving on to question number 4, it says, hey, Katie, could you talk about why self-harm helps relieve our intense emotions in the moment of self-harming? Could you also talk about why someone touching where we self-harm can be so triggering? My friend grabbed my wrist the other day and I freaked out. I thought this was great and I wanted to include it because, first of all, it got a lot of thumbs ups, but also it's about emotion regulation. When we don't have the tools that I talked about earlier on, like learning how to be mindful and check in with ourselves, learning how to identify the emotions, know we need to take a break, processing it or talking it out with someone. When we don't utilize those tools or we don't have them, no one's ever shown us, we don't know, we can utilize some unhealthy coping skills as a way to deal. Things like self-injury, eating disorder behavior, shopping addiction, gambling addiction, drugs or alcohol, all with the goal of either kind of expressing it in some way. Like I think sometimes self-injury can be that way, like expressing the pain that we feel, or a lot of times it can be the stuffing down, the numbing out, okay? So to answer the question, why does self-harm help relieve our intense emotions? It doesn't help anything. I think if you paid attention, you would notice that the emotional experience goes down and comes right back. Now, that right back could be an hour, it could be a day, but I find it's usually within a couple of days, usually a day, but we'll give it a couple of days. So it doesn't relieve anything, it distracts. Self-injury gives us something else to focus on. And for a lot of my patients, especially the ones that feel intense emotions, and that's why they utilize it, it can feel like it's a way of expressing that. But unfortunately, it's not very expressive. It doesn't help us process anything. It doesn't really make anything better. And I know that doesn't make it easy to stop doing. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its own benefits for us in our emotional experience. But I'm just telling you that it actually doesn't relieve the emotions. I think if you paid attention, you would notice that they come right back. It just gives us a little bit of reprieve in the moment. And that's why I always encourage my patients, if you're feeling really uncomfortable, if you're feeling intense emotions, you need to have an impulse log. It's in my book, Traumatized. I offer one, but you can also go to selfinjury.com, look in their resources tab, and impulse logs are in there. They explain them, they tell you how to use them. But in the impulse log, I always have my patients try to do some other, 5 is the goal, 5 other coping skills, meaning something like go for a walk, call a friend. Maybe we need to drink water or eat a meal. Maybe we're feeling run down that way. Maybe we need to journal a little bit. Maybe we need to pet our dog. Those are all some things that we can try to do, color, organize, there's zillions of coping skills. And once you do 5, well, usually I break it up into 2 chunks. So let's say you do 2, I want you to wait 30 minutes. I want you to try doing at least 2 more and then wait. And then you have my full permission to go on. And the reason that I set it up this way is because usually I'd say 90% of the time, by the time they've waited 30 minutes and tried the other coping skills, the moment has passed. That urge has peaked and it has gone back down. Not always, but most of the time. And so that just shows you that it's not the self-injury that makes the intense emotion go down. Instead, it's just a distraction. Because also it's important, and this is a random nerdy fact before we move on to question number 5, emotions only affect our nervous system for 90 seconds. That emotional response, let's say I feel anger, my brain dumps, or my nervous system really dumps all the chemicals of like stress response and things into my bloodstream to get me ready to take action. Like I want to fight, right? Gets me all amped up. That rushes through my system, readies me to take action. And if they took a blood sample, they'd see it. And then 90 seconds later, they wouldn't see it anymore. The reason that we feel emotions for such a long period of time is because we keep thinking about it. We keep going back to that situation, the scenario that caused that emotional response, and we keep repeating it to ourselves. I'm not saying we don't have a right to do that. I'm just saying know that self-harming doesn't actually fix anything. If we allow an emotion to exist and we acknowledge it and we feel it go through us, it will go away. But if we keep injuring ourselves with the information, with the situation, then it can last forever and get incredibly uncomfortable. And then we'll find ourselves more apt to do things like self-injure, overuse drugs or alcohol, and things like that. Okay? Oh, and then the last part of the question, why does someone touching where we self-harm, like why is that triggering? I think, I'm just going to guess here, but this is my belief based on my patients' experiences. It feels a little bit too vulnerable. And it's not even the best way I can describe it. I feel like most of my patients say something to the effect of like, having someone notice the scars or touch them makes them feel like someone's like looking at their icky insides. It makes us feel like we don't have any privacy. We feel kind of raw and exposed. And that is the opposite of what we want, right? It's self-harm is sometimes it's expressive, but it's also a very personal thing, and it can feel like our own special little thing. And when someone maybe acknowledges it or touches it, it makes us feel like it's not maybe so private when that's how we want it to be. I've also had patients who've told me that like having anybody else acknowledge the self-injury makes them want to do it more, because if it's not something that's paid attention to in the way they needed, then they'll feel like, oh, it's not as big of a deal as it really is. Like it's almost like in eating disorder land when we feel like we need to get sicker to be deserving of care. The same thing can apply with self-injury. But more often than not, when someone like grabs your wrist and doesn't realize that they're hitting something, a self-harm scar or a self-harm wound, it's more that like we feel more exposed than we would like to be. And I don't know why it triggers that in us. I think it's probably to do with the fact that it is such like a vulnerable spot for us. It is something that we're doing because we feel so shitty. And I think it's a reminder of that too. Okay. Moving on to question number 5, it says, hey, Katie, whenever I can't see my partner for long periods of time due to travel for work or holidays, I miss him, but simultaneously get a strong urge to pick a fight and break up. I really spiral, feeling worthless and unloved, and am disgusted with myself. Similarly, as soon as my therapist is away on holiday, I wish I had a session. I freak out. I want to quit therapy for good. This seems to be a weird pattern throughout my relationships, and I can't quite get a handle on it. Where can this come from, and how do I address it? I really struggle to not impulsively act on feelings. In case that's important, I do have ADHD and suffer from complex PTSD due to emotional and physical abuse during childhood. Thanks for everything you do. Of course, this experience is avoidant attachment. This push-pull feeling, it could even be disorganized, kind of. But I find it's an unhealthy attachment either way. I'd have to ask a few more questions, but let me give you kind of a rundown, okay? When it comes to unhealthy attachment patterns, anxious attachment, the one we talked about earlier, is like the fear of abandonment. We want to pull people really close. We don't want to let them go. Like the fact that your partner would have to travel would be really painful for you, and you wouldn't like them to be away at all, ever. And when they came back, you'd not want to let them go, okay? When we have avoidant attachment, we would feel like, it's good that they're gone. I don't really want them to know anything intense about me anyway. Like even having someone move in and having a really deep relationship, we would most likely still hide big pieces of ourselves as a protective mechanism, and would kind of relish in the fact that we knew more about them, or that they felt more comfortable with us than we did with them. That would help us feel a little bit more independent, and we would like that separation. Now, even as I talk about this, I'm like, maybe this is more disorganized, because then disorganized attachment is when we have this push-pull. We kind of toggle between, it is a little different than this, but a lot of people say it's a toggling between anxious and avoidant, and it is in many ways. I know my disorganized folks will be like, it's different. There are some nuances to it, but for the sake of understanding here, we need to know that disorganized attachment is kind of the like, oh, I want you close, and then when someone's close, we're like, that doesn't feel safe. I need to get you out of here. And we kind of do that push, pull, push, pull, push, pull as a way of regulating our nervous system. Because like you said, you grew up with emotional and physical abuse, so you have complex PTSD. That's where this comes from. This feeling of like not really feeling safe, but it's almost like, I feel safe, I don't feel safe, it's like because we never had a consistent attachment with either of our parents. No one was safe for us. We didn't get to healthily attach knowing we had a safe foundation with which we could explore the world and go out and try things. We didn't get that. And so to have a partner who goes away and comes back, it's kind of triggering. And it makes you want to pick a fight, because you're like, I wanted you here. You feel that anxious attachment, like, oh yeah. And then they come back and you're like, no, you weren't here. And we feel abandoned. And so we lash out and we push them away. And we're like, see, I can't trust you. I can't feel safe with you. You're inconsistent. Even though they're really not in the same way, it's triggering something within you. Potentially a reminder of your childhood of inconsistent parents, or they'd say they show up and they didn't, or they were nice and then they weren't. It's triggering that inside of you. And so how do you work on this? How do you address it? As you work in therapy on your complex PTSD, this will get worked on at the same time. I would let your therapist know this is happening. Let them know that you think you have a disorganized attachment. Say that you feel this like push-pull within your relationships, because letting someone get close and having intimacy and a healthy relationship feels scary. And so part of it's going to be learning how to regulate our nervous system. Also, part of it's going to be doing some inner child work, hearing from younger you that went through all those horrible things and listening to them, validating them, and maybe offering them a little support or compassion along the way. But as you continue doing the work that you're doing, it will get better. Yeah, just let your therapist know that this happens with them and with your partner, because you said you want to quit therapy for good and stuff. Let them know that you're feeling this way. I also have my attachment workshop. That could be helpful for you too. And I have tons of videos about attachment that would be a good place to start. But it will get better. I believe this is part of your trauma. And as you process that through, it will improve. Okay? So hang in there. Let's move on to our final question. Question number 6. It says, "Hi, Katie. I recently broke up with my long-term partner. It was very hard, but not dramatic. I just fell out of love. But it triggered many feelings of fear about aging and loneliness. I feel sometimes like I'm a bad person that is not deserving of love, and I feel guilt about the breakup. My ex is a good person, and there was no cheating or fights. We were in a 4-year long-distance relationship after 2 years of a normal one. And when we got back together, I just didn't feel the same. That's okay. It happens." A couple things to unpack here. I don't love the term "I fell out of love." Like I know people love like falling in love and falling out of love. I believe love to be a little bit different. I believe love to grow out of learning about each other, sharing in experiences, and the excitement and enjoyment of sharing life with someone. I feel like that's where love comes from. The compatibility factor, like we have similar goals in life, similar values. We enjoy some of the same things and we have fun together. I think a lot of values that we place on friendships should also be placed on our romantic relationships. But in the same way, like I know sometimes people can give you the ick, right? You can be in love with someone, you can think that it's great, and then all of a sudden they start giving you the ick. I honestly believe that always comes out of being triggered. I know you guys are going to hate that, but it's the truth. We don't fall in and out of love like that so quickly. And if we do, that means something else is going on. It's almost like the way that I approach like overreactions. When we have an overreaction, like something small in our life happens, but we feel very strongly about it, that tells us there's a bigger thing happening. It's not just that one thing. That one thing seems small because it is, but it's really attached to a much larger pattern or a bigger situation we're going through. And in your case, I wonder if you were triggered with them coming back. Like, was there something about your independence or something about, I don't know. I'm very curious about this because yes, we can not be as interested in someone. Like relationships just don't work. It doesn't have to be big cheating fights and stuff like that. That doesn't have to happen. But I'm just curious. You let me know. If it was like a flip of a switch, it's a trigger. And if it was slowly and surely, because 2 years of long distance is very difficult. If that just slowly distance you from them and you feel like I don't really need them in my life and I'm not really in love with them anymore, that's fair too. We can slowly, quote unquote, fall out of love like that. There's nothing wrong with that. And distance does not make the heart grow fonder. For a short period of time, it is exciting. Or if they're gone for a couple days here and there, we get excited to see them when we come back. But 2 years, I don't know if you saw them in those 2 years, I'd assume so. You just said long distance. But not being able to be consistently in each other's lives is never healthy for a relationship. I believe it slows things down. It puts emotional distance as well, obviously physical distance, but emotional distance in between you and your partner, and can be the first like fissure or the first chasm to occur in your relationship. Now, the feelings of like fear of aging and loneliness, I guess I have a couple thoughts about that, because I've had friends decide that they're going to get married because they feel like it's the time and they should, and we're the right age and I don't want to be old and alone. I don't believe that relationships should start based on that. That's not a healthy space. Because I don't want to be alone, I'm going to be with anybody. That doesn't feel right to me, right? We all know we can be in a relationship and be as lonely as we've ever been. relationships actually don't fix anything. It's about true connection. And so just think about that. But when you talk about the fear of aging and loneliness, I'm curious where this comes from and why we think we've picked up on it. Is there a certain age that we think is too old and then we're going to be lonely forever? Like I'm an old cat lady or old cat man or whatever. What is that? Because sometimes we have these like fears or these beliefs, and we have to consider where they've come from, why they're here. Do we really believe that? And fears are things that I believe come out of some kind of vulnerability space. Like I'm afraid of the dark because I am afraid that I could get hurt, right? I can't see things, so I can't prepare myself. It's scary. I'm more vulnerable in the dark, right? So this fear of aging and loneliness, do you think if you don't have a romantic partner, then you're automatically lonely? And as you get older, you'll be more lonely? Like, I'm curious because those things they don't necessarily equate, right? We can be not like untangled, like not in any romantic relationship when we get older, but that doesn't mean that we're lonely. We can still see our friends and our family, make time for people in our life. So I'm curious this jump and why we connect that. So I guess since I don't really, obviously there's not like a specific question here, so I don't have a specific answer, but I can tell you that I believe that you should do some diving into your reasons for wanting to be in a relationship and be out of a relationship. I would like you to figure out where this fear comes from. Like, when did it start? Is there like a specific age we feel like we have to settle down by? What is it that makes us think being older and not in a romantic relationship means we're going to be lonely? See if we have any people in our family or in our life that are exceptions to that, because I have a ton of those. And I think that's why I'm like, that doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? And also I would even argue that like my friendships have nothing to do with Sean. That's separate, right? And those continue on, they were there before he was around, some of them. So those are part of my community. I don't feel lonely if I have my friends. So just think about this a little bit, because I feel like we're jumping to conclusions a little bit. We're letting a fear take over. And I do not believe in starting relationships because we're afraid of what it might look like if we don't. Relationships are extra. They should be seen as something that we do because we can't imagine not being with that person. It has nothing to do with our age or the timing or what we're afraid of might happen if we don't decide to be with them. Relationships should be created out of a space of, I can't imagine my life without them, and they make it so much better. And I just love doing things with them. That's where it should come out of. So just think about that. Take some of that stuff to heart. Journal a little bit. See what comes up for you. Because there's you've jumped in from a relationship and then decided to end it, which sounds fine, but now are triggered because something about being lonely and that you sometimes feel like you're a bad person and not deserving of love. And those negative thoughts, I'm wondering if that triggered the breakup, if it like was getting to be too good of a relationship and you're like, I don't deserve this. We can do that. We can sabotage when we're like, this is not the relationship for me. I don't deserve this. And so we'll sabotage. So we'll end it. Even though there was nothing wrong, we actually love the person. But somewhere in our brain, we have this deep belief that we're not worthy of it. So we're like, oh, this is my exit plan. This is how I get out. Do some thinking on that. See if any of that rings true, because we don't want to repeat this pattern if it happens to be a pattern. We want to figure out where it's coming from so we can make better choices for ourselves in the future. Does that make sense? I hope so. That's it for today, you guys. I hope the answers were helpful. I hope that you liked that it was kind of a little more focused around a couple of topics versus scattered. But you let me know in the comments what you think. Have a wonderful, wonderful week. Thank you for sharing the podcast. Thank you for watching the podcast. You do your homework, and I'll see you next time.